And this is a class that we call Summer Sundries. In other words, the subjects that are presented don't necessarily overlap, but in fact, today they do. We spoke about Ukraine when Jerry Kirkpatrick gave a couple sessions, and now we're going to be speaking about Ukraine again. I do want to say that it's really with regret that I say that the organizer of many of our classes on humanities, Ellen Efros, died last week. She was responsible for this class, as well as anything dealing with humanities, social sciences, the arts, and we really miss her. It's going to be a quite difficult role to fill. So today we're having a discussion on Russia and Ukraine. The title is Prelude to War. Our speaker today is Fletcher Crowe, who retired to Gainesville and lives in the Village. Fletcher has a BA in European history from Stetson University and an MA and PhD in history from Florida State University, where he studied Soviet foreign policy. His dissertation was on Soviet access to the Turkish Straits, the Black Sea, and Ukraine. He's taught it at Florida Atlantic University in Boca Raton and in the history department of Bethune-Cookman University in Daytona Beach. Fletcher has conducted research on medieval England and the French exploration of Florida in the 16th century. Recently, he published a paper on the French colonial settlement at Fort Caroline, which some think was located close to modern Jacksonville. He served as history consultant to the city of Gainesville as well. Maybe today he can tell us how to end this awful war between Russia and Ukraine. Fletch?
How's this for sound? Is that okay? I can tell you how the war is going to end, but you have to pay extra for that. So, does anybody want to move forward so we all kind of sit shoulder to shoulder here? Okay, everybody can hear in the back, okay, huh? All right. Okay. Let's see, can you get the main screen up? Okay, here we go. All right. The last time I was here, Ellen kept saying, slow down, slow down, slow down. So if I'm going too fast, right hand up means I don't understand. Left hand up means slow down. Okay. All right. So I'll slow down if I see any left hands coming up. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. So I have a tendency to have way too many slides. So if we go over the normal time, I want two hands to come up and we'll try to get out, I'll curtail it and we'll get out as fast as we can. But for anybody who kind of wants to stay extra, we can talk and get into this just as deep as anybody wants to, okay? All right, you've already heard presentations about Ukraine and the United Nations in this organization. But today I wanted to ask a different question. Every day on CNN or whatever, NPR or what all, we hear about this battle and that battle and this battle and that battle. But what I haven't heard is a look at the relationship between Ukraine and Russia over a long period of time. And in my judgment, that's a real gap. For us to really understand the news, understand the situation, understand the complexity, I think we have to really roll back the time scale many, many hundreds of years and see the overall picture, okay? So that's what I want to do today. The last time I gave this talk, everybody had questions about the near-term stuff, in the last, week or two or three. And I'm certainly prepared to talk about that. But first, let's talk about the origin or the background, the roots of all this conflict that we see. Are there any thoughts or questions or ideas before we get going here? Anybody? Okay, we're on. Okay, this talk is really not about the Ukraine, it's about Texas. All right, think about this. Shut your eyes right now. Just shut your eyes. Shut your eyes. What if you woke up and the New York Times tomorrow morning said Texas has sent 100,000 troops to get Texas back? Whoa, what would you do? What would the President Biden do? What would the United Nations do? What would the Republicans do? What would the Democrats do? Mexico is going to get Texas back. Well, that's essentially the same problem that we have with Russia and Ukraine right now. So throughout this talk today, let's just think about what you would do if suddenly Texas was threatened, okay? Well, here we are, the standard first map. Ukraine is in brown. You can see how it's a transition point between Russia on the right and Western Europe countries on the left. So it's very important. It's a country of over 40 million people. Sometimes we don't think of it as a particularly important player, but that's in the same league as, let's say, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Great Britain, and so forth. So it's a large country, large in terms of land and large in terms of people. Today, we're going to talk about a lot of things, unless you fall asleep, and then you won't be able to pass the 10-point quiz at the end. But you can see here in the upper left, we're going to talk about Ukraine in the Middle Ages, and we'll talk about the Russian annexation of Ukraine. We're going to talk about the Crimean War. You may have studied, in freshman in college or something in world history, but maybe that one's a little dim right now. We're going to talk about Stalin and the kulaks, which I believe somebody already talked about in this particular program before, I think. We're going to talk about 1938 and Anschluss, and we're going to talk about Chernobyl. A lot of us can remember the Chernobyl horrors that we saw on the newspaper and on TV. And we'll talk about what's going on right now with the sale of Russian natural gas. And we're going to talk about the Minsk Agreement. Who right here knows what the Minsk Agreement was in 2015? Anybody? I see no hands. Well, we're going to learn. Oh, I see one hand in the back there. Okay, we've got one. All right. We're going to talk about the Minsk Agreement, which underscores everything that we're going to be talking about. And then you see in the top right, we're going to talk about the Battle of Stalingrad, where 2 million service people fought, largest battle in the history of battles. And we'll talk about the Yalta Conference of 45. A lot of us were alive during the Yalta Conference. And then we're going to talk about the Ukraine getting its independence from Russia, which was 1991, and on down the list. So these are the topics that we're going to be talking about. And then maybe when this is over, we can kind of come back to this and see which ones we need to focus in on a little bit more. Okay, let's roll it back a little bit. Here we go. You see here in the top left a structure for living made out of bones of probably mammoths from 100,000 years ago. That's the kind of homes that we saw in Ukraine 100,000 years ago. And then you see in the bottom picture here, the homes of mammoth hunters of perhaps 20,000 years ago. People, Homo sapiens came out of Africa perhaps 60,000 years ago and entered what we think of as Western Europe maybe 40,000 years ago. So you see, these are Homo sapiens just like us, about 20,000 years ago. But let's fast forward just a little bit. The people that lived in what we think of as Ukraine had a technical marvel. It wasn't fusion. It wasn't Twitter. It was the wheel. They had this incredible technological advance, so much more advanced than all the other civilizations in what we think of as Europe. And you can see here what archaeologists have found as the wheel. And that really gave them immense amount of power and ability to travel around. And then here's, let's see, yeah, there's, whoa, let's see what we got here. See if I can do this right. Here we go. With the wheel, maybe 7,000 years ago or so, people living in what is the Ukraine today moved west and also south. And so they were the founders of what we call PIE, the Proto-Indo-European language, which is what we speak. It's the same that origins of Italian or German or Spanish or also Iranian and Hindi. So you can see here that the individual languages that we think of as so different really all stem to that original language that was spoken north of the Black Sea in what is today Ukraine. If you remember your freshman history, when the Greeks were celebrating classical Greece and building the Parthenon and such things, the powers to the east were the Scythians, who lived north of the Black Sea. And you can see here a grave good from a Scythian funeral. And you can see here on the map that north of the Black Sea is where the Scythians lived. The Greeks would visit them sometimes, but they were considered extremely fierce. But beautiful gold objects were what they were able to produce. So it was very advanced, but these people were predominantly nomads who roamed around. And here's another battle with Scythians, very, very difficult, very brave, but very warlike. So let's just keep on rolling along here. Here we are, 1000 AD. In other words, we've gone about 1,500 years ahead to about 1,000 years ago. And what do we see 1,000 years ago? We see a culture centered in what is today Kiev, which of course is the capital of Ukraine, but it was called Kievan Rus. The people that had formed this culture were actually from Scandinavia. So today, when you see the news on CNN or whatever, you see a lot of blonde-haired, blue-eyed people being interviewed by CNN, right? Well, why are they blonde-haired, blue-eyed? Because the original people that settled that area, which is Kiev today, were from Scandinavia. And you can see here's where the Scythians lived. Here's the Black Sea. And you can see Kiev, which of course is in the headlines every day in the newspaper. And we can see Moscow. Let's see, where is, well, it's not on this map. Okay. Well, you can see the Black Sea here and where the Scythians did live and where the Kievan Rus people settled. The church here on the left is a reconstruction of a church that the Kievan Rus people would build. And you can see Vladimir here, who is a patron saint of the Ukrainians. Now here is a map that shows the Varangians. They were the Scandinavians that I mentioned. And you can see the arrow here is pointing down. They would come down the rivers and come down to what we think of as Ukraine. So Ukraine has this long-standing tradition, linguistic tradition, cultural tradition, DNA culture of Scandinavia. And here are some pictures I found of some of the Varangians. And then the Mongols attacked. You can see here on the right, there were three avenues of attack in the early 13th century, from the northeast, from the west, and from the southeast, all heading toward Kiev. Those Mongols were a disaster. They were horrible. If you think of the worst things about the Nazis you can think of, multiply it by 100 and you've got the Mongols. They were fierce. But they took over the land that is today Ukraine. And on the left here, you can see how they continued on to the west. They got as far as Hungary and that area of what we think of as Eastern Europe. But they, of course, had overrun the area that we think of as Ukraine first. So to get more into modern history, Putin says that he thinks of himself as sort of a new Peter the Great. Well, what does that mean? A new Peter the Great? Well, around the year 1700 or so, Peter the Great, as the head of the Russian Empire, sent his troops south toward the Black Sea and was able to conquer some areas that bordered on the Black Sea. Of course, this gave the Russians access to warm water ports when it was winter in Russia, and that was what the Russians desperately wanted. So here's Mr. Peter the Great. Does he look like Putin to you? That's, anyway, Putin thinks of himself as the new Peter the Great, able to conquer South and Ukraine. Well, for many hundreds of years, the area that was Ukraine was, of course, part of the Ottoman Empire. And you can see in green here the extent of the Ottoman Empire, huge empire, extending over almost to the Atlantic, through Egypt, of course, through Turkey, obviously, and in Southeast Europe, and of course, in what we think of as Ukraine right here. So culturally, there's a lot of cultural tradition from the Ottoman Empire. For example, when you think of Bosnia today, 2 million people in Bosnia are Muslims. We think of Europeans as being predominantly Catholic or Roman Catholic, perhaps, but certainly Orthodox Catholic. But in Bosnia, you have 2 million Muslims. And that, of course, is an outgrowth, obviously, of the Ottoman Empire. Well, now enter Catherine the Great. Around the year 1800, about contemporary, let's say, with Thomas Jefferson. Catherine the Great sent her troops south to try to capture more land that was occupied by the Ottomans north of the Black Sea. So let's see, here we have the Black Sea right here, and you can see how the Russian Empire extended down to the Black Sea. That was a strategic interest, strategic objective of Moscow, of the Russian Empire, and she certainly succeeded in that. So when we think of a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, we have to remember this slide right here. Catherine the Great extended Russian power into and fully through what is today the modern Ukraine. And that was roughly 1800, over 200 years ago. Oh, good. All right. And then enter Napoleon. How many people can sing the 1812 overture right here? Anybody? Come on, we got some singers here. Anybody? We know the 1812 overture, but think about it. Napoleon really dominated Europe, just absolutely dominated it. But he sent 600,000 invaders into Russia and only 100,000 returned. Utter catastrophe, total catastrophe. And you see here, obviously, what one artist thought it looked like, with just corpses littering the snow everywhere. But that's a major landmark in the history of a place like Ukraine, because Russia, and therefore Ukraine, are scared to death of invasion from Western Europe. And of course, that's what Putin talks about every day, every time he meets, every time he talks to anybody. He talks about the Nazis, and he talks about invasion of Russia from Germans. And this is invasion of Russia from the French. Terrible, terrible catastrophe. Now the Crimean War. Anybody remember what the Crimean War was all about? Well, that's a dim part of history, huh? Charge of the Light Brigade, darn right it was. Well, we wrote a poem about it anyway, didn't we? Okay. In the Crimean War, first of all, what is the Crimea? The Crimea is this little peninsula here on the north side of the Black Sea. And obviously there was a war there. You see these arrows where the ships would come to the Crimea. But what happened in the Crimean War? Well, as you can see right here, there was an alliance of France, Britain, and the Ottoman Empire against Russia, and the Russians lost. And you can see here an artist's concept of what the war looked like, not dissimilar from the American Civil War, as you can see, but just a horrible catastrophe. It was here that Clara Barton made her fame with the beginning of the Red Cross. But today we don't think about it. But if you were in Russia and you knew something about the history of your country, this would be part of your cultural background, of this idea of the West ganging up against your country, causing total chaos. Well, on to 1938. It's my belief, and you may challenge me and say you don't agree, but it's my belief that the reason that we're seeing a conflict today is because of Anschluss in 1938. If you recall, Germans had moved into Austria and were demanding that France and England allow the Germans to overtake little Austria and have Anschluss, that is, to integrate it into the German Empire. Well, you know what happened. Appeasement. And so the English said, well, okay, if we just give in once, Hitler won't ask for anything else, and we won't have any war. Right. So since then, Western European powers and the United States have been scared to death of appeasement. And so policy setters today in Washington or Paris or London or what all are scared to death of being hung around the closest tree for appeasement, afraid to attach their name to appeasement. And well, you've seen the results. It's every day in the newspaper, every day on CNN, you see the results of digging their heels in and not buckling under to Putin with appeasement. Let's see. Well, we could move on to World War I. That was 1938. And now I guess I misspoke. I'm got these backwards, I guess. Obviously, the Anschluss problem was 1938, but this slide goes backwards to World War I. In my view, all of the international relations that we see today in the 20th century and the 21st century are all just footnotes to Versailles. If you remember, Versailles was a series of treaties that ended the conflict in World War I, starting in 1919 and so forth. So there were Versailles treaties, as you can see here, with a number of the Eastern European countries that were given their independence. That set the stage for all the conflict that we've seen since, in my judgment, whether it's World War II or whether it's the Cold War or any other conflict that set the stage for the next 100 years. And in these Versailles treaties, we see the independence of Eastern European countries. On this map, you can see Lithuania, you can see Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, all set free in the Versailles treaties. And of course, the rest, as they say, is history. Anybody need me to stop and take a break and talk about questions or thoughts that you're thinking about right now? Anybody? Okay. Let's see, we got a chair here. Oh! At some point, chairs become wonderful objects, right? All right. Well, okay. Stalin and the kulaks. Just tell it to go away. In ILR, I think there was a talk about Ukraine in the 1930s, right? Am I mistaken about that? Well, anyway, let's maybe redo what you already talked about. You see here in this picture, Ukraine was filled with Cossacks. And the word in Ukrainian Cossack means free man. And they had millions of kulaks. And kulak was a farmer that had over a certain amount of land. So they were not just dirt poor. They had some land. And Stalin wanted to bring all of these kulaks under control of the Russian government. And of course, they didn't want that at all. And they were sent to Siberia by the millions. So it was just horrible. The term that's used in Russian to describe that is Holodomor, which means killing by hunger. The Russian forces caused mass starvation. We think today of horrible things, but can you imagine just having a country of 40 million people starving to death? Just incomprehensible to a civilized country today. Well, anyway, that's what happened. That was in the 30s, before World War II. Now things changed a bit once the Germans invaded Russia and therefore invaded Ukraine. Beginning, of course, in 1939. But the terror, the horror that the kulaks and the Cossacks faced was just indescribable. And there's a reason why I would include a slide like this, right? All of these slides that we've seen all add together to a cultural heritage that together generates a cultural memory, generates a cultural feeling of integration and irate feelings of being mistreated. So when you think of Ukraine having stiff resistance today, remember some of these slides, like the one we just saw with the kulaks and the Cossacks. When grandparents sit around the fire and tell the young folks about the way it was back in 1936, you know what they're saying, right? You know what they're passing on. Well, the Yalta Conference at the end of World War II. Yeah, hey. Okay, is that a little better? Okay, that's better? Okay, sorry about that. Thanks, appreciate that. Okay, well, you can see the picture here where we have Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin trying to figure out World War II. In a sentence, can anybody tell us what they decided there? Anybody remember? Anybody? I can't hear you. I can't hear you. Well, that's exactly right. It's exactly, she says division of Germany. Well, that's exactly right. The Americans were authorized to move from the West, that is from France, toward the East, of course, into what is today Western Germany and into Berlin. And as you said, the Russians were allowed or approved to move from the east, that is from Moscow, toward the west, through Poland and through what it became East Germany into the east part of Berlin. That's exactly right. But you see the picture at the bottom here. That's a picture of the Battle of Stalingrad. If you've ever read about the Battle of Stalingrad or seen a Netflix movie about it or something, the words to describe the horror of the Battle of Stalingrad don't do it justice. I don't know what words in the English language can carry the significance of Stalingrad, but you have 2 million people starving to death in the sub-zero temperatures of southern Russia or Ukraine, and everybody's trying to kill everybody. And actually, the heroes of Stalingrad, interestingly enough, you can tell all your grandchildren, were the women. The women had the ability to stand up on top of the buildings with their rifles and just sit there and sit there and sit there. And when a German came by, bam, they'd knock off the German as a sniper. And that really sort of turned the tide of war. And of course, eventually, obviously, as you know, the Nazis retreated and went back to Germany after just massive, massive destruction and untold death. Now, I think one of the significant points of having this particular slide up here is this. When Putin's army first began to invade in Ukraine, what they did was look for Nazis. They would strip the clothes off the Ukrainian men and look for tattoos that indicated membership in a Nazi party. Well, of course, that was utter nonsense, obviously. But the term Nazi in Russia and therefore in Ukraine has this incredible emotional baggage because of what you see right here. In other words, just about everybody's parents were killed by Nazis. So here we are. We're at the year 1991 right now. That was a very important year because Boris Yeltsin was the head of the Communist Party in Russia, and under his tutelage, so much of Eastern Europe was set free from Moscow. And you can see here, of course, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, but not Ukraine. Now, Putin has called the action of Yeltsin to allow this the worst day in world history. Now, I've noticed that I didn't say that quote. That was my friend Putin. But from Putin's standpoint, that was the worst thing that had ever happened. The Russian Empire just evaporated overnight. Now, Ukraine wasn't included in that, but of course, Ukraine in a few years would be set free, along with Georgia and Chechnya and so forth. But what we've been seeing here for the last year in the war between Russia and Ukraine is Putin's efforts to overcome what occurred in 1991, where East Europe was set free. So, so Ukraine did get its independence, and Yanukovych became the head of government in Ukraine, but he refused to sign the papers that would allow Ukraine to join the EU, the European Union. And so great riots broke out in downtown Kyiv, what was called Maidan Square. Have you ever seen the movie on Netflix about the riots in Ukraine. It's just horrible riots. Just everybody's being beaten up, bloody by the Russians. But you can see, of course, a picture right here of what the riots in Maidan were. But the bottom line is that Ukraine did not join the EU, and so we see the effects of that today, obviously. She asks, why not? Well, the president of Ukraine was a puppet of Moscow, and so he was not at all interested in having a Western-style government in Ukraine. Now, obviously, today you see Zelensky, of course, who has real close relations with the Western democracies. But we're talking about here 2004, a very different situation. Just as a parenthetical note to that, for a while we had a parliament in Ukraine, and you can tell this to your great-grandchildren. There was a plurality in that parliament in Ukraine in those days that was actually pro-Russian. Let me say that a little more clearly. You know what a plurality is, right? In other words, it's not exactly a majority, but it means that's the largest group, right? There was a plurality in the Ukrainian parliament that was actually pro-Moscow, which would be pro-Putin. Now, that's not the condition today. And then obviously today, what has been Eastern Ukraine, of course, is dominated by Russian troops. So it's totally different today. But I'm saying in those days, you had a very strong element that was pro-Russia. And then everybody here in this room remembers 1986 with the Chernobyl accident. You can see here in this picture, I kind of like this picture. This is taken by an airplane or a drone or something over the unit, the Chernobyl nuclear plant that got so hot it just melted down. Just terrible. But one thing to remember today is that Chernobyl is just north of Kyiv, not very far. Just, drive a car an hour north and you're in Chernobyl. So it becomes a very frightening situation. Julianne, can you be our timekeeper here and make sure that we're not, we're about 2:10 right now. Okay. Keep us posted here, okay? All right. Well, here's what you see on CNN every day, and in the front page of the New York Times or whatever. You see in eastern Ukraine, you see these areas that are dominated by Russian forces. And then, of course, you see the Crimea down here. And here's Odessa. Did you notice in the newspaper this morning, did you notice what happened? This morning, CNN and New York Times and all reported that for the first time, shipments of grain have been able to leave Odessa to go down the Black Sea to be sold on the world market. First time, just happened 24 hours ago. But you can see here on this slide where Russian troops have dug in. Here's Kyiv, but all this area over here is still relatively free of Russian troops. This is a map that I particularly think is valuable for us to think about today. It's an ethno-linguistic map of Ukraine. So what does this tell us? On the east, we have a large share of Ukrainian citizens whose primary language is Russian. And then here, where it's red, the primary language is Ukrainian. Now, if you know anything at all about languages, you'll know that Ukrainian and Russian are very similar. So when I hear Ukrainian, to my ear, it sounds like Russian. Now, I'm no expert at this sort of stuff, but it's that close. It's as close, I believe, as, say, Portuguese to Spanish or Danish to Norwegian or something, that close. But you can see here that a very large share of the Ukrainian population, they're at home, their primary language is Russian. Now, the footnote to that is that historically, Ukraine has had a lot of universities, fine, respected universities. So a lot of Russian students have actually come down from Russia to study in what is today Ukraine. And boy, doesn't that mix up cultural issues, right? I mean, it's very complicated. But let's stop for a second and just look at all of this from the 80,000 foot level. What do you see at the 80,000 foot level? What do you see for the last 100 years? What I see is the end of empires. To my way of thinking, we see the sense of loss and the grieving and the misery that the British conservatives have felt at the loss of India, the loss of Pakistan, the loss of Egypt. What I see is the grieving, the sense of loss in Paris with the loss of Vietnam, loss of Algeria. And then the same thing holds true for Russia. We see Putin absolutely irate, just beyond irate, thinking about the loss of Georgia, loss of Ukraine, loss of Poland and Hungary and so forth. So that being the case, what does the future hold? We see Putin absolutely irate with what are called color revolutions. You've heard all these in the news as you've read it over the years, but sometimes it's hard to keep it straight. Here's a little cheat sheet to keep the color revolutions straight. The Velvet Revolution was in Czechoslovakia. And Czechoslovakia, doesn't even exist anymore, right? We have two countries. We have Czech Republic and we have Slovakia. The Jasmine Revolution was Tunisia. That was the first one, wasn't it, Richard? Wasn't that the first one of these? Egypt had the Lotus Revolution. The Rose Revolution was in Georgia, and then the Orange Revolution was Hurricane. To say nothing about Poland with Lech Walesa and Solidarity. So you had all of these color revolutions making sure that they could try to set themselves free from Russian control. And that, from Putin's standpoint, is a total horror. The last few slides I have here to present today are what you might call current affairs, current situation militarily. I have ended what I advertised as what was going to be the talk today about the historical roots of the conflict. But if you want to stay for this, it's fine. We could talk today about some of the military issues that we are reading about every day. You can see here on the right, we can see a comparison of the Russian military with the Ukrainian military. Obviously, it's a David and Goliath kind of thing. The Ukrainians have been very successful at blocking Russia, very successful. We're going to talk about some of their military weapons that have allowed that to occur. But if you need to have a little refresher on who's in NATO and who's not, I've got this slide right here. You can see originally NATO was formed right after World War II. So the ones in darker blue here are the original members of NATO. But you can see in Eastern Europe, we have a lot of new members of NATO. This is extremely critical because every day I read the headlines in the paper to find out if NATO has been invaded by Russia. And you know what would happen if a NATO country is invaded by Russia? World War III would start immediately. World War III. Now, Donald Trump said that Russia, or that the United States would not support Estonia if it were invaded by Russia. I'm sure the Biden administration, of course, disagrees with that because Article 5, of the NATO treaty says that all the NATO countries are obligated to go to the support of an invaded country. So if Estonia is invaded, regardless of what Donald Trump says, World War III would be with us instantaneously. So what does that mean here for us? Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, you can see they're in the lighter blue. Here is Romania, which is in lighter blue, Bulgaria. Here's one you've never heard of before, Montenegro. And of course, Austria is independent, just like Switzerland is, if you remember. But just recently, Sweden and Finland joined NATO, or at least went through the process of application to join NATO. We got a question here. Okay, she says, go back to the color revolutions. Here we are. Her question is, were they internally inspired or from the outside? From what I know, and I think I'm right, the people that were conducting the riots and therefore the revolutions were all internal, in the sense they were citizens of those countries who desperately wanted independence. I can't hear you. Independence from Russia. I think I'm right about that. Now, people in this room are old enough to remember 1956. Remember what happened in 56? Hungary. In the case of Hungary, those were all Hungarian citizens, right? Remember Lech Wałęsa in Poland, and all the workers at the docks? Those were all Polish-speaking Polish citizens, right? And on down the line. Any more questions? Okay, let's move along. Here I have numbered some of those NATO countries. In no way do I want to instill fear and trembling in any of us, but I have to say there is a theoretical possibility that we could see an awful enlargement of this conflict because of the question of NATO. God forbid. But to run down the numbers here for just a second, just take a second here. Look at this: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. We have Poland as 4. We have Czech Republic, and now we have the Slovakia Republic. And then here's Hungary, 6 right here, and right here, 7, and then 8 is Romania right here. And then you see Slovenia. You know who the famous person from Slovenia is? Who? The ex-first lady, yeah. Melania Trump is from Slovenia. So I think Trump would have gone to war if the Russian troops had moved into Slovenia. Except her parents got out, so I guess it's okay, right? Anyway, Croatia, you know where Croatia is located? Let's see, it's right here. Montenegro is right next to Croatia, right on the coast, right here. And then Albania, right here. And then North Macedonia, right here, tiny little place, about the size of Alachua County. And Bulgaria, of course, right here. Those are names we need to keep familiar with, because if you turn CNN on and you see Russian troops rolling through Bulgaria, you know what that's going to mean. Okay, let's roll back just a little bit here for a minute, as long as Julianne says we got time. You remember 1962. I was a freshman in college then, and I was scared to death. It looked like the world was going to break out in nuclear war, and almost did. But in secret, the American government told the authorities in Russia that the Americans would remove the intermediate range ballistic missiles from Turkey, and the Russians would remove their missiles from Cuba. Well, that conflict never broke out in nuclear war, but it came that close to nuclear war, that close. We don't hear about that much today anymore, but that's the sad truth. So we know that Putin doesn't want to have nuclear war. We know that certainly that Biden doesn't. But do we have enough safeguards to prevent that? I don't know. When we look at the conflict between Ukraine and Russia today, I think it's valuable for us to look at what had occurred before the conflict broke out. Well, certainly what had happened was that under Putin's tutelage, Russian troops had absolute catastrophic devastation in several places, in Chechnya and in Georgia and in Aleppo, Syria. These pictures, of course, are from those locations, but let's take a look at a map and see exactly where those places are. Here's some maps. Okay, Georgia is on the east side of the Black Sea. Remember what's hanging down from the north side of the Black Sea? Crimea. So this is just sort of southeast of the Crimea. So on the east side of the Black Sea, we have Georgia. And then there's this little place here you can see called South Ossetia. That is under a different rubric. Also, if you see, here's Georgia on the east side of the Black Sea. Northeast of Georgia is Chechnya, which is really sort of right on the border of Russia itself. So when the announcer on CNN says, well, the Chechens got devastated again by the Russians, you know where that's located. But one thing to remember is that Chechnya people are Muslims, and that is really kind of rubs a person like Putin the wrong way, But do you remember what the relationship between Chechnya and Boston has been in the last few years? I can't hear you. Right. Remember at the Boston Marathon a couple of years ago, there was an explosion. A lot of people were killed. You remember who did that explosion? They were Chechen rebels. And of course, in Chechnya, explosions had been set up all the time to kill Russians. But for some reason, the Chechens in Boston thought that if they killed marathon runners, that would kill Russians. But I don't think that holds much water, do you? But anyway, the next time you hear Georgia or you hear Chechnya, these are the maps that you can keep in mind, right? Let's see, is that on the map here? Yeah, okay. Yeah, Richard says also Armenia, which is right here, which is an independent country today, right? Yeah. Well, Armenia has been a source point for well over 100 years. If you remember, during World War I, the Armenians didn't want to fight on the side of the Ottoman Empire, and so there was just unending hostility and massacres in Armenia. You know the term "starving Armenian," right? That's where that comes from, World War I. And even today, the president of Turkey is sort of quote unquote at war against Armenia, just even today. Okay. Well, for those of you who are Fox News fans, you'll know that Tucker Carlson has been rooting for Putin, and John Bolton, who was a major international relations figure in the Trump administration, has said nice things about Putin. And when Russia invaded Ukraine, you remember what Donald Trump said? He said, "Well, that's very savvy," was his term. So also Franklin Graham, who's the son of Billy Graham, has said very very positive things about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So you can see that from the standpoint of conservatives, many of them have been tacitly supporting Russia. In fact, right today, there's a conference conservative conference in the United States, and they invited Orban from Hungary to be the keynote speaker. And, I guess if you know, Orban is extremely anti-democratic. Well, here we go. Julianne, should we cut it off now?
Well, maybe if we want to, I can go check Zoom and see if we have some questions and have some discussion.
Okay, let's sort of take a break right here, answer questions, and anybody who wants to go on and have more slides about current affairs, about current military activities and that sort of thing, we can have more on that. But let's stop right here and have a time for some questions and thoughts and reflections. Okay, we have one in the back.
I've got a question. Under the NATO agreement, do all the members have to agree in order to declare war and to fight, or is it a majority?
Well, as I recall the wording of Section 5, I don't think the word declare war is there, but they have to defend, I think is the word that's used, as I recall, which of course means movement of men and materiel. Okay, I don't know if that's war or not, but it's support, to defend.
Let's say certain countries don't want to. Let's say Turkey.
Well,
Turkey doesn't want to get involved.
That's true enough. But we know what the wording of Section 5 is, and that's what I'm quoting right now. So theoretically, they would join right in. Now, if that had occurred during the Trump administration and Estonia had been invaded, it's possible that the Americans would not have remained loyal to Section 5, but that really never hit the fan. Do you guys know the only time that Section 5 has ever been activated? I bet you do. Only once in history. Once. It was after 9/11. After 9/11, countries like Germany, excuse me, I'm sorry. Let me get something to drink here. Germany, France, England, all began to militarily defend the United States. We have some other questions here.
What is your sense of possible unrest within Russia of people who are not pleased the way this is going? And I especially would point out the oligarchs who I keep hoping somehow there'd be some formulation of resistance.
I think everybody heard her question, right?
Yep.
She has my view of internal issues vis-a-vis Putin. Well, I don't have any inside information. We do know that a lot of people have been studying that question. Before all this happened, there was at least one channel in Russia itself that was independent of the Russian government. And so that channel, TV channel, actually would broadcast information from groups that were not necessarily really strongly supportive of Putin. That no longer exists. And Russian law now forbids that type of thing. So it's very hard to get really accurate information unless somehow the Americans or somebody has done that and it's not been released to the general public. My personal guess, my crystal ball, is that there is a residue that's hostile to Putin, but it's not that large. It doesn't have the force and effect of that it would in a parliamentary democracy like the United States or France or Great Britain. The military? Well, the military is becoming more and more disaffected. Let me give you a statistic right now. If you don't remember anything else from this talk today, remember, here's a statistic that I think you deserve to remember. Listen to this. At the beginning of the war, Russia committed 150,000 troops to the war. At last count, 75,000 of those were either killed or wounded. Think of that. Let me say that again. To me, that just is overwhelming. At the beginning of the war, the Russians devoted 150,000 people to the war effort. Today, it's believed 75,000, that is 50%, are either killed or wounded. If I were a general or a colonel or something in the Russian army, I would be outraged, just horrified, right? Just unbelievable.
It's been their history. Every time they invade, it's really poorly done.
Did everybody hear what Richard had to say?
Well, I can say it again.
Say it again.
Basically, every time Russia has invaded Chechnya, Georgia, and others, that the Russian army fails to achieve its objective. It's a pattern that in the beginning of the wars, Russia military fails.
You heard what Richard had to say. It's been said that the Russian military guidance doesn't have the same attitude toward the preservation of life of the troops that exists in the United States. So therefore, they're much more willing to sacrifice lives through a meat grinder of horror than, say, American troops do. Okay, here's a question over here. Oh, okay, he's ready to go back to the other stuff. Anybody else want to chime in here? There's one more back here.
I've got a last question. It seems though Russia's been committing significant war crimes. And I was just wondering what you think will there be any consequences for that? The killing of civilians, the killing of captives, POWs. I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
You heard his question. He asked about war crimes. Let's broaden that up just a little bit. Do you remember during the Carter administration, there was the situation in Bosnia, and so we had Serbians massacring the Muslims in Bosnia, and they were accused of war crimes, right? And so they were brought to the World Court, which is in the Netherlands, and there were trials, and actually Slobodan Milosevic was convicted, remember? But to be able to convict him, they had to really seriously document all those horrors of all the massacres of the Muslims. And they did, and succeeded. But it wasn't an easy task. They had to actually convince the World Court that these were indeed offenses that needed to be adjudicated. So you could use that example to look at the current situation in Kyiv or some suburbs of Kyiv, where a lot of activities went on that look like on the surface that they're war crimes. Of course, my crystal ball is kind of cloudy, but I would think that the ability to prosecute the war crimes is going to depend on actually what happens in the war itself. I mean, if for some reason, so let's say Putin dies and the Russians withdraw, let's say, it all may become kind of moot, right? Or if the Russians continue to have, great power over things like the World Court or whatever, it may be just meaningless to try to butt your head against a wall. But all things being equal, if the situation is similar to the situation in Bosnia, the prosecution of the war crimes, worked. I mean, that worked fine, right? Okay.
I have a question.
Oh, how are we doing here?
Yeah. In the year 2000, I visited the Ukrainian city of Lviv, and I visited a cemetery for World War II war dead. And the person who was guiding me there was a little bit unclear of how to describe who was actually interred there, because apparently the Soviet view of who was there differed from the Ukrainian view. And it was evident to me at that time that the Ukrainians were going about to rewriting their history, which had been written very much from the colonial Soviet perspective. So, could you talk about any of that and what that might mean for the way Ukraine interprets itself today?
Well, you guys all heard Rick's question. The way I interpret Rick's question is that at the very beginning of World War II, Moscow thought of the Ukrainians as being just like, say, Americans think of Hawaiians, or think of Texans, or think of people in Puerto Rico, let's say, just happen to have a little bit different accent, live a little far away, but are really an integral part and parcel of that country, right? So if you have a cemetery where they bury quote unquote Russians, they can bury quote unquote Ukrainians next to them, right? That's my interpretation. Now today, Ukrainians have a strong sense of nationalism, but in those days it wasn't really allowed, right? The Russians really tried to eliminate the use of the Ukrainian language, like in schools and universities and so forth. It didn't last, but there was a great attempt. All right, here now for the second half of the show, we're going to continue on with some of the military stuff. You're free to leave if you want to, or if you have other things to do, but this is the bonus here. Okay, here we are. I guess I can move on from that. Okay. The question of natural gas from Russia is really a major issue. Some of the European countries, like Germany, for example, really depend on Russian natural gas for heating, and it's cold in Germany in the winter, I can tell you. And you can see here that Germany gets half of its natural gas from Russia. Italy, 46%. France, 24%. So Russia has this stranglehold on natural gas coming into to Western Europe. Now, most of those countries have said they're going to swear off Russian gas, but not Germany hasn't totally agreed to that yet. But you can see that the Russians have the Western Europeans by the neck.
Can I give a comment on that last gas issue?
Let's see.
So that's much bigger than I thought it was, especially because I had harbored hope for LPG from the United States is liquefied petroleum gas as being the savior, because there are plants. Okay. I guess I'm surprised by how much is on this map. I didn't think it was quite that high, and I had hopes that the LPG movement in the United States, building plants to liquefy natural gas and ship it by sea, as they've been doing to Japan for at least 25 years. And I don't see how the LPG can be a solution to so much gas through so many countries. I think that is a pipe dream, maybe by the Republicans or some other group.
Well, I know if I were living in Germany right now, I'd be scared I'd be scared of freezing to death this winter. Here are some of the pipelines that are bringing natural gas to Western Europe from Russia. You can see how they're coming down from the north and moving to the west. Some of them come from the east and move across Ukraine into the west. But of course, with this situation where natural gas is cut off, you can see, of course, what's happened to the price of natural gas. It's just skyrocketed. Now, you know who that hits? That hits people in Gainesville, because GRU burns a lot of natural gas, and the price that GRU has had to pay for natural gas has skyrocketed in the last, say, 6 months. So whenever you pay your monthly bill there for gas and electricity, thank Mr. Putin. And the same thing is true for oil. Russian oil is a very, very major export of Russia. And the question, if you didn't hear, is how did this all arise? How did Russia become such a major exporter of oil and natural gas? Well, part of that goes back to 1973 with the Arab oil embargo. In 1973, the United States was importing great amounts of oil from Saudi Arabia and some of the other OPEC countries. When that embargo ended, American policy was to try to find new sources for oil and natural gas. And one of the places they turned was to the Soviet Union. And so that it was a formal American policy. And of course, that obviously was manifest in Europe just as well, because they too had suffered from it. I can't hear you. I can't hear you. You say fault. She said U.S. fault. I don't know. If you had been the president of the United States in 1974, what would you have done? Well, I mean,
we already experienced with the oil embargo from Saudi Arabia what can happen when they start cutting off. So if I were president of the United States, I would take oil from my own land.
So in 1973, American government saw OPEC, Saudi Arabia and Iran, Iraq, as untrustworthy of supplying carbon fuels at a reasonable price.
That's
So
correct.
it says, okay, so we got to find new suppliers. So where do you go? You go to Nigeria, you go to Africa,
No, you go to the United States, you dig in your own land.
She said, no, you go to the United States.
That's right. You dig
Well,
in
if
your
you
own
want to, well, I'm not going to argue with you, but if you open up new oil supplies in northern Alaska, let's say, it could easily take 10 years to open up supplies, because you've got to build pipelines, you've got to get permits to drill, you've got to move people in, you've got to defrost the land.
See, but you didn't solve the problem. The problem is we become dependent on other people to supply us of our energy. To solve that problem is to have our own.
She says to solve the problem, if you were the president in 1974, to solve the problem, you do what?
I will solve the problem by digging our own, of supplying ourselves.
She said
with
you'd
our
solve the
own.
problem by digging
Yes.
in Alaska,
See,
let's
if
say.
you start looking for other places,
All I'm saying is
it
that
can happen again.
all I'm saying is if you dig in Alaska, it's going to take you at least 10 years to get any oil out. Okay, one comment here and then Richard. First, right here.
Another element of this, though, is the environmentalists and long pipelines going, from source through the United States, and the problems that can come with leakage and all that kind of stuff. It's just another factor that shouldn't be overlooked here.
So she said that one of the issues there is environmental concern. Yeah, if you are north of the Brooks Range, that's a very fragile environment. And so environmentalists would jump all over you if you're the president and wanted to drill north of the Brooks Range, right? Okay, so now we have one
Okay.
right here, and then Richard.
Many of the Scandinavian countries now, though, are using more solar and wind power. I noticed they're promoting cars that are more electrically driven than gasoline driven. And like Finland, it said, got, I think 94% of its oil or gas from Russia, but they don't use that much oil or gas. That's the thing. Now, I know Germany and Poland will suffer, but some of these other countries won't suffer as much from the loss of gas because they're trying to get other forms of power. Yeah, Germany is also. So I know it is, they definitely are going to suffer from the loss of the gas, but if they continue to work on developing the solar and the wind power, would they be in better shape in the long run? Yes.
Well, that's true. What she said is if you turn to renewables, you could replace your carbon-based fuels with renewables, but that could easily take 20 years. Well, but if you have a certain penetration each year, it would take you a long time to get up to that degree of 46%, right? We have a question here with a woman.
Fletch, I realize that on the list of countries which are getting gas and oil from Russia, none of the Scandinavians was listed.
So here's that list right here.
There's no Finland, no, Finland is there, but Denmark, Sweden, Norway, none of them is there.
So where did Denmark and Sweden get their heating from? Is it? Well, Norway is an exporter of hydroelectric. So a lot of that hydroelectric power in Norway is fed to other Scandinavian countries.
Fletch, do you want to keep going with questions or do you want to get through your PowerPoint?
Keep going, they say. Okay.
Okay.
You ready for a second helping, folks?
Yep.
All right, here we go. All right. Well, here are some of the locations of some of the conflict. You're probably familiar with these. It's hard to watch television without seeing these places, but just to be real quick about it here. Here's Kyiv right here, the capital. We know that was the site where the Russians first headed, and the Russians got absolutely clobbered trying to take Kyiv at the very beginning. Remember, just absolutely clobbered. And then Kharkiv is the second largest city in Ukraine. That's been on the news every day here for the last several months. And Luhansk and Donetsk are areas that the Russian little green men took in 2008. And so these areas have been under Russian control since then, in other words, for a long time. And of course, here's the Crimea. The little green men took over Crimea at that same time. Here's Odessa. That's where the ship left with the first load of wheat since the war began. And I hope that continues. But here's what Ukraine looks like today. Right here on the Sea of Azov. Well, let's talk about some of the weapons that the Ukrainians are using with such effect. This particular weapon right here that we see is called a Javelin anti-tank man-mobile rocket. You can see the Ukrainian troops haul these around on their back and set them loose. And this particular rocket is smart enough to fly over a tank and know that it's a tank. And then when it sees the tank, it drops straight down. And then it hits the port on top of the tank, which is less armored than the other parts of the tank, and just bursts right in. And it makes the top of the tank pop off. So it's been extremely effective. Do you remember what Donald Trump said about the javelins? You remember? He got impeached for the javelins. Remember? Because he said, well, okay, if the Ukrainian government will do a study and see what Hunter Biden, the son of Joe Biden, was up to, then he'd send him some javelins. And then that was an impeachable offense, and he got impeached for that. This is a Bayraker drone from Turkey. These have been extremely effective. They only cost $1 million a piece, and the Ukrainians have been extremely effective using it. As you can see, under the wings are these missiles right here, and so it can deliver very effective attack. And just recently, just within the last few days, I've read that the Russians have begun to be able to fight against the Bayrakers. But up to this time, these Turkish drones have just absolutely decimated the Russian advances. And here, this is also one of the real heroes of the war. The Stinger missile, as you can see here, is a man-mobile missile. This is the hero of the Afghan war, because the Afghanis were able to shoot down Russian helicopters in Afghanistan using this Stinger missile. And Ukrainians have had equal success with it because they've been able to shoot down Russian helicopters and such things. So the Russians actually, in the last, say, 6 months, have not used normal kinds of air attack, like helicopters and low-flying airplanes and that sort of thing, because the Russians were knocked down by these Stinger missiles that could just devastate the Russian Air Force. Now here is the picture of the cruiser Moskva. According to international law, the Russians are allowed to have a certain number of warships of a certain type in the Black Sea. Now this has been established ever since the mid-30s by international law. But what has happened is that the Russian military ships, warships, have been prowling around the Black Sea with great success. The Russians have a number of submarines in the Black Sea, and they have many landing type ships. But this particular ship is a cruise missile type ship. And when you see the headlines say that the Russians have sent a missile to attack, say, a Ukrainian steel factory or a school or a whatever, many of those missiles have been fired by Russian warships sailing around in the Black Sea. The Ukrainians were able to sink this particular one, which was really devastating for Putin. But still, he's got a number of ships that have these very intelligent cruise missiles that have just been able to just cause all sorts of damage. Richard, you have a comment?
Let's talk about freedom of navigation in the Black Sea. Do you favor the movement of some selected American ships into the Black Sea? Right now, there are no, to my understanding, the Navy has not sent any particular cruisers into the Black Sea since the war has started. Do you favor doing away with that reduction?
You're saying the American Navy hasn't sent cruisers in?
That's true.
Under international law, America, the United States, is a neutral in this war. And therefore, under law, Americans are able to send warships into the Black Sea. Even though both sides of the straits are Turkish territory, the Americans legally can send ships in there. But to my knowledge, the Americans have not sent any warships into the Black Sea.
Do you favor sending some?
Do I favor sending some? I don't. I think that that's getting too close to nuclear war. That's if an American cruiser was sunk by Russian missiles in the Black Sea, I think we would have World War III that afternoon. Do you want to comment on this? We have an expert on this stuff here.
Okay. The Black Sea is a very interesting place. First of all, as you can see from the maps, it's a closed sea pretty much. The only way in and out is through the Turkish Straits, as you put on. The U.S. Navy has always been, even back during the Cold War, very reluctant to send ships into the Black Sea, particularly large capital ships. And as a general rule, we didn't do it. We didn't send capital ships into the Black Sea. To my knowledge, I don't think there are, certainly in the last 30 years, maybe longer, you would never find an American aircraft carrier, for example, operating in the Black Sea. It's just could get bottled up in there. What the U.S. would do is exercise its freedom of navigation, as you point out, and go through the Turkish Strait and maybe send one or two smaller ships through the strait, make a couple of circles in the Black Sea, then come out again. But the risk has always been great. And in a time of great instability, as we're seeing now because of the war with Ukraine, my guess would be that the U.S. is very reluctant at this point to take the risk and send U.S. warship into the Black Sea.
All right. So when you see the headlines saying that the Russians have sent these intelligent missiles to attack Ukraine, a great number of them are coming from Russian warships on the Black Sea. I threw this slide in as a sort of a sidebar, but this is pretty interesting. The patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, who is tied at the hip with Putin, has been very supportive of the war. As you know, the Pope in Rome has not been supportive of the war and wants to have peace. But the patriarch here is very supportive of the Russian attempt to bring the Ukrainians under their control. So suffice it to say that Putin thinks of Ukraine as being a crown in the jewel, a jewel in the crown of the Russian Empire, and is still part of the Russian Empire and should remain as part of the Russian Empire. And here are some of the losses that the Russians have suffered. These numbers are pretty amazing. Just an incredible amount of loss. And you can see at the bottom of this slide, the United States, at the last time I heard, July 1st, by that time the Americans had sent over $6 billion of aid to Ukraine. Now, of course, other countries have spent a lot too. I mean, whether it's, France or Great Britain or Spain or Lithuania or Japan or whoever, a lot of money, but the Americans have devoted over $6 billion by July 1st. That's really something. But the losses that the Russians have sustained are really something. One weapon here that is not shown, but is noteworthy to take a look at today, is what is called the switchblade. The switchblade is a man-mobile little drone that can be carried on the back of a troop and can be let loose like a little airplane. And the wings come out like a switchblade and flies around. And when it sees a target, like a Russian tank or a Russian troop carrier, it'll immediately drop down very rapidly, like a kamikaze, and blow that military target up. Extremely powerful and hard to prevent and very successful. Got a question here? Let's just try a mic.
Where is Turkey in this conflict?
I can't hear you. What?
Where does Turkey stand
Turkey.
in the conflict?
Oh.
Well, it seems to me that they can do a lot of things in the interest of peace by closing the Bosphorus Strait.
I think you all heard her question. She says, where does Turkey stand in all this? That is a heck of a question. We could talk all day about Turkey. There's so much to say. Turkey could, with certain president or something, be a real intermediary for peace. But today, Erdogan is the strongman leader of Turkey, and you wouldn't expect him to be particularly in sync with Western countries like Great Britain and France and so forth. Erdogan can be a real thorn in the side for the Americans. Now, Turkey has used its good offices as a place for a number of conferences between the Russians and the Ukrainians. So a number of headlines have come out from Turkey about agreements that have been forged. But in many cases, the agreements are signed one day and then the next day the Russians violate them. So that hasn't lasted real well. Under federal or under international law, if a country is a belligerent against Turkey, Turkey can actually close the Turkish Straits, which would have a real devastating effect on the Russians. That obviously hasn't happened yet. She said, in the interest of peace, we could do that. Well, I have a magic wand, and when I wave a magic wand, I can change who is the president of Turkey, and I can make the Turks do exactly what I want. But my magic wand hasn't been working lately. This is what a Russian tank looks like when it's hit by one of these Switchblade attack drones. The top turret blows off, and all the men inside are immediately killed. I said that over $6 billion had been devoted by the American government to uphold the Ukrainian government. This is how various tranches of money have been delivered to the Ukrainians. Maybe we have a question here, but maybe somebody can help me out. To my knowledge, the conservative right has not raised a lot of stink about this money going to Ukraine, but maybe somebody can give us more clarity on that.
My question kind of relates to that. I wonder, I have no way even to think about this, but what impact this has on our U.S. economy right now and our supply chain issues. I mean, looks like a huge amount of resources and manpower that must be devoted to this.
Well, you heard her question. She said, we're looking at over $6 billion devoted to Ukraine. She says, what does that have as an impact on the American economy? Well, Richard's the economist. He can help with that. But to my knowledge, it hasn't had that much impact. I don't think. I mean, look, we have a $12 trillion economy, right? We have $4 trillion a year brought in to run the United States government. And we're talking about giving away $6 billion here, right? In the grand scheme of things, that doesn't really affect inflation or the stability of the dollar a whole heck of a lot. Right, Richard?
Well,
Richard said the dollar is very strong anyway. So it hasn't weakened the dollar at all. You thought what? That America has given to the Ukraine? Well, you may be right, but my sources have said by July 1st, it was just over 6 billion.
Fletcher, I don't know how many more slides you have, but let's go finish the slides. And then whoever wants to stay and have a discussion, can we do that?
Yeah, this would be fine.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody, for coming by. I really appreciate your attention. There are more. Did you want to see some more?
Yeah, you can finish that, but let's hold
All
the
right, so
discussion
everybody
until the end.
is free to take a break and get a cup of coffee and come back some other time. Okay, what do we got here? Well, this slide was prepared before the headline that came out this morning that said that a ship filled with wheat had left Odessa for Africa. But I think what is important for us all to remember is, well, let's go back. What is important for all of us to remember is that there are something like 14 countries, particularly in Africa and Southeast Asia, that depend on the Ukraine for their food supply. That is for wheat and oil and seeds. And a lot of countries now, especially in Africa, are facing the possibility of starvation unless that wheat comes out of Ukraine. Now, the headline this morning was exciting. You know, we're thrilled to death to see the wheat coming. Is that going to continue? I don't know. God, I hope so. But Ukraine is the fourth largest exporter of grains. And so a lot of countries depend on their supply of wheat from Ukraine for them to avoid starvation. What is going to happen in the next week, in the next month, in the next year? I just don't know. It's really frightening. So here's the question that all of us face. That's why we're here today. What's going to happen next? We know what has happened in the last year, where every one of us is very all too familiar with what has happened. What will happen next? There are some international specialists who think that Putin's next attack will be on Moldova. You may have never heard of Moldova before, but it's a Romanian-speaking country that is on the border of Ukraine, south of Ukraine, right next to Romania, and it's not part of NATO. So at one time, it was part of the Soviet Union, part of Russian Empire, and there's some speculation that Putin may head into Moldova. As you can see where Odessa is on the map right here. So Russian troops are right close to Moldova right now. And if they just go, 50 miles west, they'll be in Moldova. So I don't know, keep your fingers crossed. What about other locations? Estonia is one. The Russians several years ago had a digital war against Estonia. They blocked Estonia digital communications, television, radio, whatever, internet, especially internet. And Estonia really suffered, but it was only like for 48 hours, so it wasn't for too long. But what if Russia hits Estonia again? Estonia is a NATO country. Let me say that again. Estonia is a NATO country. If Putin moves some guys just 40 miles to the west, they're in Estonia. And then where we will be, you and me, every one of us. There are a lot of Russian troops in Belarus right now, and the head of the government there is very close to Putin. So we're not likely to see an attack, but it's an area that could have, say, revolution or something. Your guess is as good as mine. If I were Mr. Putin, I would not attack a NATO country. I just think it's too dangerous. I think American missiles are in submarines around the world, just ready to go, with nuclear missiles. I think I think Putin's smart enough to leave NATO countries alone. So if that's true, then the next attack would be on Moldova. Moldova is what? She said Moldova doesn't even have an army. It's that small. And they're certainly not part of NATO yet. So, can we avoid nuclear war, boys and girls? Can we? Rick thinks we can avoid nuclear war. Tell us why you think we can avoid nuclear war.
I just think it's unthinkable that there could be an accident, but apart from that, any intentions probably would be dissuaded by concerns about what could really happen in a nuclear war.
Putin has played the nuclear card a couple of times in the last 6 months, saying, you know, if you blankety blanks do one more thing, we could see the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Now that could be just a bluff, a poker bluff, but that is what he said. So I don't want to make people get so scared they can't get to sleep tonight, but that is a possibility. What if there were an accident? What if a Russian airplane strays into a NATO country, gets shot down, and a nuclear weapon goes off accidentally? Dr. Strangelove. A lot of wars sometimes are inadvertent. There is a possibility greater than zero that some horrible catastrophe could occur inadvertently. I just read just today, I guess it was, that the Russians are using the nuclear power plant in Ukraine to be a location where they're sending rockets from. So the Ukrainians are not returning fire to those locations, because if they return fire, it might explode the nuclear power plant, and then we'd have hell to pay. From Putin's standpoint, that's pretty savvy. From American standpoint, that is just outrageous. Can we avoid nuclear war? What? She said what?
I think a lot has to do with Putin's psychological state, because he doesn't necessarily make rational decisions. And we try and answer these questions with these kind of weighing this and weighing that. I just think if he thought he was close to defeat, he would do something drastic.
Well, what if the Ukrainians send little green men into Russia and start bombing Russian stores, Russian churches, and Russian government buildings? What would Putin do? Okay, let me say it again. What if Ukrainians send secret warriors into Moscow, and that tonight, with the cover of darkness, the Ukrainians start bombing Russian Orthodox churches and Russian military locations, Russian government office buildings, and Russian apartment buildings? That's not far-fetched, because the Chechens did exactly that. So what if you wake up tomorrow and the headlines in the newspaper say, Ukrainians sabotage Russian installations in Moscow? Okay, play Putin for a second. What would Mr. Putin do? I don't know. If I were in the CIA and I was giving advice to Zelensky, I would tell Mr. Zelensky, keep your boys home. Don't try stuff like that. That's playing with fire. That's my version. Okay, that's all the formal slides I have. Anybody have any thoughts here for us? Jerry?
Hi. I just want to say a couple things, on this subject. I mean, who knows, what Putin might do, and everything is within the realm of possibility. But in terms of probability, I would think that, escalating to the nuclear level is, at least at this point, extremely unlikely. First of all, there has not been a nuclear weapon used since World War II. And it would be a absolutely tremendous threshold to cross. Russia has a lot of conventional capability that it has not used and could use in terms of escalation, even if the Ukrainians, who have been very careful at this point, the Ukrainians have not tried to take the war inside Russia in a meaningful way. And the war at this point actually has been, from the standpoint of armed conflict in the world, in the contemporary world, has actually been pretty much managed. It's a tit for tat, kind of thing. But Russia has a lot of conventional capability at its disposal in which it could use to escalate the conflict should it feel necessary to do so. But I want to go back to just something back to 1974, when you talked about the Arab oil embargo, because I think it kind of just leads into an important point. And I guess one of the questions was, why would the U.S. turn to Russia for oil supplies in 1974? The interesting thing was, during that time, the Cold War, and it ties into this idea of conflict management. Since the end of the Vietnam War, there was a thaw. There was a gradual thaw in the Cold War, which continued all the way to the end of the Cold War, when both the Soviet Union collapsed and the Warsaw Pact was dissolved. There was never a major flare-up after Vietnam. And the other thing was that the U.S., largely under the auspices of Henry Kissinger at the time, worked closely with Russia to bring about an end of the war in Vietnam. The Soviet Union was the major arms supplier to Vietnam, to North Vietnam, during the Vietnam War. The Soviet Union was a very heavy backer of North Vietnam during the Vietnam War, and it was largely the cooperation between the U.S. and Russia that was very instrumental in bringing the Vietnam War to an end, which was about the same time, if you recall, as the Arab embargo, which caused, if you remember, I remember it vividly, and I'm sure everyone in this room does. You could only buy gas on even in odd days. There were blocks long lines to get into gas stations to buy gas. And it was something that needed to be solved quickly. And Russia had supplies, oil supplies, that could be used for this purpose. And the other thing is, I know there are veterans in this room. Will is one, a Cold Warrior like myself. My time in the military, except for the last 5 years, was during the Cold War. The security, the international security environment, particularly between the U.S. and Russia, was much more stable then than it is now. There are a lot of things in place. For example, there were agreements. There were many agreements, and there were top-level summits between the top national leaders between the U.S. and the Soviet Union going back to the 1960s, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, during Johnson's time, for example. And then going forward, there were a number of top-level summits. And then there were many more conferences and agreements between the U.S. and the Soviet Union all the way to the end of the war. And it was this continuing thaw, the heat. If you think of it kind of as a, as a thermostat or, a regulator for a gas stove, that the heat was gradually lowered from starting after the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think the Cuban Missile Crisis scared both sides. And after that, there was this continuing thaw, which was very, very gradual. But after the end of Vietnam, then the slope, was steeper, all the way down to the end of the Cold War. And there were agreements. For example, there was in the naval context, there was the Incidents at Sea Agreement. We had an agreement with the Soviet Union to diffuse any kind of incident at sea. And these things could happen accidentally because our naval vessels could be operating in close proximity. So one crosses the bow of another one, let's say, which causes, let's just say a Soviet ship crosses the bow, because we're always watching each other. We're always following each other, watching each other. And we got a little too close, and one crosses the bow, and that causes our ship to swerve. And, they did it intentionally and that sort of thing. The Incident at Sea Agreements, we had these signals. And under the Incidents at Sea Agreement, they could send a signal and say, whoops, sorry, we didn't mean that. We didn't mean that. And it was the same thing with aircraft flying in close proximity, because we always escorted each other's aircraft. So U.S. aircraft U.S. fighters would intercept and escort Soviet bombers. Soviet fighters would intercept our bombers and do the same thing. And there were these de-escalation and deconfliction procedures. And then there was the hotline. Remember that we had the hotline sitting on the president's desk? We don't have that today. We don't have these things. We have what they call Uncle Joe procedures. We actually had an agreement with the Soviets in the naval side where we would rescue their sailors trapped in a submarine disaster. And it was called Uncle Joe because that was the name, was Stalin's nickname, Uncle Joe. We had these Uncle Joe procedures where we would actually, if a Soviet submarine got in trouble, we had rescue procedures. And they had rescue procedures, and they would come to all these things went on outside of public view. Okay? So we had all these things during the Cold War, which kind of just fell out of disuse at the end of the Cold War because, Russia was, the Soviet Union collapsed. Russia was not a serious threat to anybody. And so the security environment was much more stable than it is today. So what scares me, as I think Fletcher was pointing out, is the potential for an accident, for something unintentional, some unintentional act that could cause escalation. And once that starts, who knows, it could very well get out of control. But I just wanted to point out the difference in the security environment between the Cold War and what exists now with Russia. It's much more unstable. The Soviet premiers during the Cold War, they weren't crazy. They were not crazy. There was predictability there. Even on the land side, we knew where the Russian forces were, say in East Germany, for example, and the Volga Gap and all that. Much more certainty in a relationship than exists now with Putin. Because, he is, to a great extent, unpredictable. And that's a real problem. All right, I think
this is going
to... I'll get off my soapbox.
I think this will go down in history as our longest ILR session. We thank everyone for staying with us at this ever-changing issue. Thank you, everyone.
And thanks, Fletch.